In a world recovering from war, the figure of a man who would defy all limits emerges. A cultural icon, an action hero, a symbol of strength and determination. But behind that smile and that imposing physique hides a story that few know. Arnold Schwarzenegger, the immigrant who achieved the American dream, was he really the hero he was sold to us, or perhaps he had a dark side that remained hidden in the shadows? Arnold's is perhaps the best-known biography in the world. We are talking about a man destined to be just another inhabitant of an Austrian village. However, he went against what his parents, his country, the people wanted and became one of the most successful people on the planet, being an example and inspiration not only for his generation, but also for ours. Everything has been said about Arnold. Recently we have known his version, the way his eyes have seen his life. Instead of Arnold, enemies, friends, lovers, detractors, celebrities, close friends, everyone has spoken. And that makes it complicated to know the teachings of this unrepeatable life. For that reason, today we will delve not only into the lights, but also into the shadows. In the mentality of a man without scruples, willing to leave everything behind, who brought bodybuilding to the streets, who enhanced the masculinity of his generation with his action movies, and then influenced public life. Arnold was not president of the United States because his constitution forbade it. But how far did his ambition go? What lies behind the most ambitious and tenacious mind of the last century? And of course, to understand the mentality of one of the most ambitious men, you have to travel back and go to where in psychology they say that all our concerns arise, but at the same time also all our traumas and our fears. All this is marked by the environment, in this case a small town in Austria that was recovering after the Second World War, in which barely 800 people lived. Arnold was born into a very humble family, and as he said, where he was destined to grow up and work as a farmer, get married, and have a mundane life like his parents. It is precisely here, in the projection that his parents had about their son, where Arnold's first inner fire to thrive is born.
Is that growing up like the way I did, poor, and with none of those luxuries, all of those things, made you much more hungry for success. My father was kind of like, a plus and a minus. My father really contributed a lot to my hunger. And my father contributed for me to wanting to get away from Austria and to get away from home. Because, they were not like, come on Arnold, stay, you can stay as long as you want. No, with 15 I already had to pay to live at home. I made 300 shilling a month as an apprentice, and 100 shilling I had to give my parents so I could get the food. They made me contribute, and I hated that. I said to myself, this is uncalled for, because my friends didn't have to do that. So it was that kind of a thing. So I said, I'm gonna get away as fast as I can. I will show you guys. So it gave me the motivation to just leave and get out.
Arnold tells us that his relationship with his father was quite complicated, not only because he was very strict, but also because he had a certain preference for his older brother. In addition, Arnold's father, in a turbulent time in history, came to belong to the Nazi Party, which made Arnold years later to investigate if his father ever committed or participated in any atrocity. However, this never happened. Although from his father, Arnold probably acquired that rigidity that in the future would make his interpersonal relationships very questionable, but at the same time catapulted him to achieve everything he set out to do. In one of his many interviews, Arnold confessed that the strict Austrian-German education that his parents gave him, that with every punishment, every blow, every argument he had with his parents, only gave him more strength, and he even confessed to them that this was not going to last long, that he was going to leave, and that he was going to become rich. With that mentality, Arnold tells us that he faced his life already in his childhood. And where was Arnold's relief during all this time? Well, in training. In 1960, the Austrian oak tree man set foot in a gym for the first time after his trainer had taken him to improve his general strength in other sports. Soon Arnold discovers that he was born for it. Let's just say that the gym was Arnold's spark that ignited that whole dream. That whole dream of becoming somebody, of making it big. He had also grown up watching Steve Reeves movies playing Hercules. He knew that having a good physique could open many doors for him. For that reason, he had no qualms about training as much as it took. At the age of 15, Arnold decided to focus on bodybuilding instead of soccer, or more than bodybuilding, in strength sports in general. Arnold was a weightlifter, he was a powerlifter. He found his sources of inspiration in the movies. Precisely in the male figures of that time as Reg Park, the aforementioned Steve Reeves or Johnny Weissmuller. And with his passion already defined, Arnold comments that he also told his parents that he was going to be the strongest man in the world. So he begins to train to find a medal in a local competition and gradually work his way up the sporting ladder. However, the Austrian military service got in his way. Arnold had to surrender to the army of his country in 1945 when his mind was still focused on his progress. He knew that Austria and the future did not go hand in hand, and that in order to reach his longed-for kingdom of opportunity, as he called the United States, he had to leave the country. And in that same year, 1965, an opportunity appeared before him to begin to stand out in Europe. While he was doing his military service, Arnold deserted, escaped from his instructions as a military man, and went to the Mr. Europe in the junior category. So you can see if Arnold was a visionary or not. He already saw that championship as his ticket to America, in his own words, the place where he could become a star and become rich. So in 1666, he took his first flight to London to participate in the Mr. Universe. He ended up in second place because he did not have the expected muscle definition. But Arnold's shape and size already had the potential to move up to the top ranks of bodybuilding. His arms, his prominent biceps, and above all, one of the most remarkable pecs in history, were Arnold's calling card to the world. Of course, he was not unaware of his condition and knew how to showcase strengths that are still being held up as an example 50 years later in bodybuilding today. But we are with Arnold's story, and at this point, after a second place, begins what we can consider the beginning of Arnold Schwarzenegger's bodybuilding career.
As every woman in the hall agreed, when the supermen of Europe got together in Cologne for the international bodybuilding contest. And with what pride the mighty men displayed all the well-known muscles, plus a lot that the average man had never heard of.
Determined to get out of Austria by any means necessary, Arnold was able to get together with one of the judges of that competition. And seeing his potential, he took him to London and set up a training program supervised by him, putting much more focus on leg training. But at this point, the dream of a young man from Austria was beginning to come true. That same year, Arnold met an idol. You may remember Reg Park, one of his childhood inspirations. Well, he became not only his mentor, but also his friend. In 1967, at the age of 20, Arnold won Mr. Universe and became the youngest bodybuilder ever to do so, only 20 years old. And this was the physique Arnold had. The Austrian oak was getting it, he was becoming a man, and at 21 he got his long-awaited ticket to the United States.
I finally arrived here in 1968. What a special day it was. I remember arrived here with empty pockets, but full of dreams, full of determination, full of desire.
Arnold steps into America with a certain cachet. The cachet of a young man who has already won everything he had to win in Europe, who has arms of 50 centimeters and a rib cage never seen before. And just at this point we must talk about one of the figures who most marked Arnold's life, Joe Wader. For many, bodybuilding is what it is today because of Arnold's legacy. However, the one who really had the vision of the potential as a business, of selling a man's body as something to admire, was Joe Wader. Joe Wader, who had founded with his brother a publishing house that sold magazines in this style, was also the promoter of the supplementation brands that today support fitness. Of course, gym equipment and machinery. But if Joe Wader has been known for something, it is for being the father of the contest that would bring together the greatest bodybuilders around the world since the year 1965. We are talking about the Mr. Olympia. When bodybuilding competitions were still being held, combining it with weightlifting, Joe Wader bet entirely on bodybuilding before anyone else. But he knew that to promote it, he would need a hero, an inhuman figure. A Superman who would sell all his magazines and be an excellent image to promote all his businesses. Joe Wader sponsored this Austrian with a man, honestly not Marketingian at all, but with a physique that would have to face the greatest physical beast of that time. And this was none other than a Cuban named Sergio Oliva. Sergio Oliva came from winning the Mr. Olympia in 2 consecutive years, 1967 and 1968. At that time when Arnold set foot in America, Joe Wader put him up in an apartment and covered all his expenses. He just told him to train as much as he could. We arrived at 1969, Arnold's first Mr. Olympia. And before going on stage, Arnold realizes the stiff competition that awaits him. Backstage, he saw a beast. A Cuban beast that proposed a paradigm of bodybuilding quite different from Arnold's physique. Sergio Oliva managed to bring together all that mass and that impressive big physique with a much narrower waist, really long limbs and also very powerful arms, a much more elongated biceps and historic forearms. Arnold later went on to say that Mr. Olympia saw himself as a loser from the start, and in such a competitive mindset there was no room for failure. So Arnold, after that defeat against the Cuban myth, decided to get to work and do everything in his power, since he had come to the land of opportunity. To America to succeed and not to settle for any second place. After talking with Joe Wader, Arnold brings his Italian friend that he had met in those Mr. Universe and training in the gyms of Munich. Franco Columbu would be Arnold's training partner in his goal to become Mr. Olympia. Arnold was so obsessed with this Mr. Olympia that he even took ballet lessons to perfect his posing on stage. All his dedication seemed to pay off. Arnold entered the Mr. Universe, one of the most special championships for him, as he shared the stage with none other than his childhood idol, Reg Park. Not only was he sharing the stage with an idol, the dream of so many of us, but he beat him. He beat him the same year he was preparing to become the best bodybuilder in the world. And now we have arrived at the Mr. Olympia of 1970. One of the most famous competitions in history, where one of the most controversial anecdotes took place. Arnold would continue with his tour of competitions, this time in the Mr. world. And to the surprise of many, guess who was also there? None other than Sergio Oliva. This would be the preparation for the truly important Mr. Olympia competition. Olympia, and this is where we can begin to see all that Arnold was willing to do to win. Arnold's strategy was clear. He knew he had the size. He wanted to arrive as defined and conditioned as possible. This would be his trump card, a trump card that had worked for him. He had beaten Sergio Oliva, but everything was yet to be written. However, off-stage he commented to Sergio that he was looking smaller, that he needed to gain mass. Of course, this was before the Mr. Olympia. He had put the ball in Oliva's court, and ill-advised at that Mr. Olympia, Oliva focused on size, on sacrificing definition in exchange for gaining more muscle mass. This in a bodybuilding that was clearly not as calculated as we know it today. But back then, Oliva let himself get there and came out very watered down and very overweight at the Mr. Olympia. Oliva had really delivered. He had managed to squeeze in between 5 and 7 kilos more than his last competition. It was the biggest physique he had ever presented, but when Arnold came out, we see a totally defined physique with every muscle cut marked, veins totally clear. And if that wasn't enough, in the post down, the last chance to show the physique to the judges. Arnold looked at Sergio and told him that they should put an end to such a long night of posing and confrontation. Then Oliva came down from the stage, and as he was getting off, Arnold turns around and stands there posing by himself in front of the spotlight and the watchful eyes of the judges. At that moment, Arnold had come up with the idea of making it look like Sergio Oliva was leaving the competition, thus setting himself up as the real winner. And so it was that night that Arnold took the first of his 7 Mr. Olympias. However, back then, the prize for winning Joe Wader's championship was no more than $1,000. Considering that today's bodybuilders reach up to $500,000, things have changed a bit. And yes, bodybuilding was still a long shot. And Arnold's vision once again made him go further. And not only did he come to America to train, but also to be an entrepreneur. Together with Franco Columbu, he founded a masonry company. However, this was not the only thing Arnold would undertake. Now it is much easier to see the foundations on which the fitness business is built. But back then it was also visionary of Arnold to start a mail-order company, selling supplements and, among other things, workout videos. Of course, Arnold also played the role of image for the guy who got a huge slice of the bodybuilding pie. Joe Wader started selling his first supplements and energy bars. All this would derive until today in the industry that we all know of products related to training and fitness. They are now part of the daily lives of millions of people. But back to Arnold's story. The year 1971 was to be a pivotal year in his life, a year that would mark his character forever. His brother Arnold Schwarzenegger died in a car accident. He had been drinking and died on impact. Wendy Lee tells us in Arnold's biography that he did not attend his funeral. And here we are given multiple versions. Arnold himself tells us that he did not go to the funeral because he was training for his competition. A year later, his father Gustav dies of a brain attack, and Barbara Baker, his first serious girlfriend, said that Arnold told her about his father's death without any emotion and that he never talked about his brother.
when my father died, because my mother called me on the phone and she said, you know, your dad died. And this was exactly 2 months before a contest. She says, do you come home to the funeral? I said, no. It's too late, you know, he's dead, there's nothing to be done. And I'm sorry, I can't come. You know?
Over the years, Arnold has given as many as 3 different versions of why he did not attend his father's funeral, a question still not entirely resolved. What had become clear was that Arnold's childhood had marked him. In an interview, he went so far as to say that his father pulled his hair, beat him with belts, said that many of the boys he knew had fallen apart emotionally, but that he was not going to do it, that this was the Austrian-German mentality, but that he was going to be a rebel. I quote, "Every time somebody hit me and every time somebody told me I couldn't do something, I said, this is not going to last much longer. Because I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to get rich, and I'm going to be somebody." In the end, if there is something about Arnold's story, it is that there are multiple versions of it. The one told by him, by his lovers, by his close ones, by his friends, by his enemies. The story that Joe Wader was in charge of building, and the story that those present at the time lived. But if there was one thing he wanted to make clear to Arnold, it was that he really had no time for regrets. That someone busy turning the page with goals with such big tasks, it is much more difficult to get lost in your thoughts. We approached Mr. Olympia again, year 1971. Once again, the battle was between Arnold and Sergio Oliva, but here happens one of the controversies that marked the future of Joe Wader's competition. Sergio Oliva was disqualified from competing that year due to a new policy implemented by Joe Wader, in which if you participated in a rival competition such as the Mr. Universe, you were banned from the competition. 1971 was a cakewalk for Arnold Schwarzenegger to win the Mr. Olympia. It must be said that today we all see the greatness of the bodybuilders of that era by their placings in the Olympia, but this was a competition that was only 6 years old, a personal bid by Joe Wader. The Mr. Universe had 20 years of prestige, and it was normal back then for the same bodybuilders who went out to compete in the Olympia to go through this other federation. However, this caught Sergio Oliva by surprise, and still to this day, in an interview given by Sergio Oliva Jr., that is, Sergio Oliva's son, still a current competitor, clearly shows how his father, after that fateful decision, holds a grudge against Joe Wader. That's when he began to understand how the business was set up, that yes, this was indeed a bet for a new federation, and particularly also for a new athlete. This was Arnold. The most curious thing is that Sergio Oliva came to pose in that championship. Everyone would boo the strategy of the Waders if one of the best bodybuilders in the world present there did not show himself to the public. And that's why we see pictures of Sergio Oliva posing in 1971 even without having participated in the event. And what did this do? It accentuated even more. It added fuel to the fire, to a rivalry that was more heated than ever. The Mr. Olympia of the 72nd was going to be that great event. In the 70s, we didn't see the best version of Oliva. In 71, Arnold had no competition. But by this year, 1972, Sergio Oliva had completely changed his training methodology. He had put himself in the hands of Arthur Jones. Many of you will know him from a video I made on this channel, for being the founding man of the company Nautilus, and the one in charge of the experiment with Cassie Viator, that bodybuilder who gained 20 kilograms of muscle in a month. You have also the video on the channel. But in this context, Oliva presents himself with one of his best physiques. As far as we can see from the photos of the time, we do see an Arnold that worsens the conditioning he brought in previous years. On the other hand, he looks slightly superior in that level of definition to Oliva. And yes, it is also true that we see an Oliva with a lot of size. Be that as it may, many who were at the championships that day argued that it would not be at all unreasonable for Oliva to take Olympia 72. To me, Arnold always looked superior in size. But Oliva's line was a much more aesthetically pleasing line. A much more pronounced cloud structure, but without ever bringing that crystalline condition that we have come to see in Arnold in later years. Be that as it may, the battle was on. It was not going to be an easy decision at all. But once again, Arnold's superiority was not just physical. That day, the room in which the pre-jump gym was to be held was too small. So Arnold proposed to change to a room where there was a much darker background that would highlight even more his structure in front of Oliva's. That being a person of a dark-skinned one, his structure would be more reduced. And this that seems silly in bodybuilding, the optical effect plays a fundamental role. For this reason, they say that this has been one of the most competed and most controversial Mr. Olympias also. The vast majority of those who were there gave Oliva as the winner. Arnold himself in a future biography acknowledged that in the 72nd Oliva was outstanding. And this is where the judges rule in Arnold's favor. Although it is known that year there was a last-minute change in the opinion of the jury, something that puzzled many, a mystery still unsolved, and that Oliva always maintained that Joe Wader was behind Arnold's win in 72. that Arnold was the cover of Wader's magazines and that the brother's influence was in the judge's verdict. Many years later, Sergio Oliva Jr. confirms that his father actually lived his whole life resenting everything that was done to him, that on the 45th anniversary of the Mr. Olympia he refused to shake hands with the Mignon family. I leave the link to this interview with Sergio Oliva Jr. in the description as well. It's very interesting to see how you can get to tell the story from one perspective and from the other. However it was, Arnold already had 3 Mr. Olympias. He was the king of bodybuilding, and there would be good years ahead for him. With Oliva already out of the competitive arena in 1993, the battle would be with Franco Colombo, Arnold's partner and friend, and a French bodybuilder who also showed great promise, Serge Nubret. But now there was no color. Arnold presented his most defined and most conditioned physique ever. Many say that 74 was Arnold's most striking physique. It was because he had gotten bigger. But in this year, in 1973, he presented arguably the best condition we ever saw Arnold in. In this championship, his best pose for me was the mos muscular, where you see more vascularity than ever. A striation in the chest that had rarely been seen. And although the legs of this era were not the size of today's bodybuilding, Arnold's quads show cuts that he had never brought before, which gives him that striking look. He wears the Mr. Olympia of 1973 on the street. He becomes the bodybuilder with the most Mr. Olympias, already surpassing Sergio Oliva, and he rises as the legend of bodybuilding. In 1974, he would face Lou Ferrigno, known for being one of the greatest bodybuilders of the time, so much so that you will all know him for playing none other than the Incredible Hulk. Arnold's strategy for this Mr. Olympia is different. That year he puts in a lot more size. For that reason, he presents his heavier physique on stage. For many, this is what has truly been Arnold Schwarzenegger's best physique. If Lou is known for being a big physique, notice how in these images Arnold is able to make him look small. At the time, he also had legs that today would be out of balance with his torso. But at that time, and especially in this year 74, they had become bigger than ever, and that's how Arnold won his 5th Mr. Olympia. And here it is worth pausing to understand why Arnold has been so different from other athletes. Because his physique is probably the best known physique in the world, and what made him so remarkable. When we talk about Arnold, his imposing biceps and pecs come to mind. But Arnold possessed a rib cage that even dozens of years of bodybuilding later has hardly ever been seen again. For example, if we go to his double front biceps, despite having a wide waist, Arnold had lats that were practically inserted into his waist. Arnold had a rib cage of incredible dimensions, and you can see this by looking at the size he possessed from the side, how wide he was. If you put another bodybuilder next to him, a bone structure not as large, you can really see the difference. The capacity to hold muscle mass that Arnold had in that body was unmatched. There really are very aesthetic physiques, also very pronounced dorsal insertions, very good pecs, but in person seeing Arnold had to be something unique. There are a lot of pictures where you can see this real bare structure of a real animal, how wide he was from the side, that rib cage so protruding and pronounced that it made him have probably the best pectoral of all time. Also not to such good biceps that yes, his shoulder was lagging behind, his shoulder was unbalanced. Imagine Arnold with Chris Bamstead's shoulders back then. In the end, it was a massive physique. His weakest point, without a doubt, was his waist. It really was a wide waist, but that's also where you could see such a big, massive physique. In addition, the pose he presented from the back was totally dense, a striated lumbar, totally deep cuts, and a peak in the biceps that very few have still had to this day. And something that people don't talk about much, not to mention a very complete physique for a person approaching 6 feet tall. No wonder they set their eyes on him for the movies, to be on the cover of magazines. And Arnold really made an impact. So let's imagine how he must have felt in the year 1974, knowing that he had triumphed, that he had the best physique in the world and started to walk the streets of Venice Beach. Well, these images are mostly from the documentary Pumping Iron. The year is 1975. Arnold was already unrivaled. He had done it all. He was the bodybuilder with the most Mr. Olympias, and his mentality was asking for new challenges. He knew where they were in the movies. What's more, he had already shot a Hercules movie, as had his idol Steve Reeves. But Arnold was Dag Malagor, and if not, look at the action.
Hercules? And who is that monster who looks as if he has come straight from the kingdom of the underworld?
But if you notice, that was not Arnold's voice, because he had such a strong accent that they finally decided to dub his voice. His English was not perfect, his accent was exaggerated, he was not a good actor. Undoubtedly, Arnold had a huge challenge ahead of him if he wanted to succeed in the movie business. Besides, it may seem silly, but his name was not commercial at all, an unpronounceable surname. In that same film, in the credits, he was called Arnold Strong for having a more commercial name. Arnold starts taking acting classes to eliminate his accent. He was convinced that his next step was in the movies. He was going to retire, he was going to quit bodybuilding. However, that year, a new opportunity arises. Robert Fjord and George Butler were looking to document the body cult to the world. That is, to make a documentary about what life was like for these bodybuilders, the people with the best physiques on the planet. Arnold went so far as to say that without having this motivation, he was probably thinking about his acting career. However, he postponed his aspirations, and this was reason enough to compete in the Mr. Olympia in 1975. You have seen the pictures we have of previous Mr. Olympias. It's very low quality, it's hard to bring this to the general public. However, the Pumping Iron documentary captures for the first time in history a bodybuilding championship in the highest quality. Not only that, but it documents the whole process. It documents the personalities of these bodybuilders, of Arnold, of Lou Ferrigno, of Franco Columbu, of everyone. You see how Arnold has a charisma and a personality that makes him always want to be the center of attention. Pumping Iron needed a media star. This was Arnold. It really was a documentary made by and for him. He documents what his life was like. He is seen as a star, someone different from the rest, someone who impresses, who captivates, who captures people with his physique and with his personality. And all this that I have just told you has a certain point of reality. But what if I tell you that really all this image that Arnold wanted to give was just part of a Machiavellian plan that he knew was going to make him much better known? And no, this is not me saying it. Arnold himself claimed that he made up many of the parts, many of the comics, all this in order to get the viewer's attention. Arnold justifies it all in the name of bodybuilding, but was he really doing it for bodybuilding, or was he doing it for his own image? Although the documentary is sold as an objective documentary, it is really a docudrama planned down to the smallest detail. In it, we are shown an Arnold training in Venice Beach, surrounded by women, surrounded by friends, very outgoing, versus a Lou Ferrigno who comes across as dispirited, training in the basement of his house, someone much more familiar, who was trained by his own father. Lou Ferrigno confirms to us that really his father had little to do with bodybuilding and what was depicted in that documentary. However, he fed the narrative thread of the story. Years later, Lou Ferrigno affirmed that when he saw the documentary, he felt that he was not the one, he saw a monster. Although the truth is that in the end, the documentary had its effect. Arnold won the Mr. Olympia in 1975, and the appearance of this documentary not only popularized bodybuilding, but also made Arnold known to the whole world. It launches him into his acting career. Lou Ferrigno too, despite not winning the Mr. Olympia, gets his opportunities. He is offered the role to play the Incredible Hulk. But at this point, Arnold, thanks to Pumping Iron, would again get another chance in the movies, this time with the film Stay Hungry. Although it was shot a year earlier, this was already a very different movie from Hercules in New York, the movie where Arnold could show off more, a role much more adapted to how he was. And it went so well, in the 1976, Arnold received the Golden Globe for Best Debut of an Actor. We were talking about the coincidence of his coronation as six-time champion of Mr. Olympia, that this is projected to the world through a bodybuilding documentary, and that he also receives a Golden Globe. It seemed that his long-awaited American dream was beginning to come together. It seemed that now, yes, Arnold could become a star. He attends the Cannes Film Festival and does not miss the opportunity to show himself in front of the cameras, to show his strionic personality. He was the best physique in the world. He was succeeding and breaking in the movies. He deserved a role in a big movie, and this is where Arnold's big break came. It is said that since Hollywood producer Edward Pressman had seen the Austrian bodybuilder in the documentary Pumping Iron, he couldn't imagine any other face, or rather any other body, than his for his hero. Arnold really had a lot of difficulty speaking English. Arnold accepted the offer, $250, guaranteed, even if the film was never made. But he saw it as much more than that. He wanted to become an actor and be a millionaire. And at the director's request, Schwarzenegger lost pounds and pounds of muscle. Really, what we got to see in theaters was the most majestic image we saw of Arnold in bodybuilding shows. There was no pretense of a bodybuilder here, nothing more. Of course, the image mattered, but he also had to match it with someone athletic and with more graphic moves. Arnold talked about climbing, swimming, horseback riding to learn how to ride a horse, daily outings to run several miles. And here it is said that when Arnold was supposed to say a phrase attributed to Genghis Khan, what came out of his throat was something unintelligible, barely resembling English. The The producers were frightened. They thought the diction lessons had been useless until Milas changed his teacher and the progress really began to be noticeable. With all this, with a few kilos less, Arnold starts to shoot the film that would give him stardom. In the year 1980, the Mr. Olympia contest continued to advance. Now new bodybuilders were coming to the fore: Mike Menzer, Frank Zane, Chris Dickerson. Arnold was out of the equation. It was known that he now wanted to go into film, and it was impossible that the same year he was shooting a movie for which he was ordered to lose muscle mass, he was going to run for that Mr. Olympia. Arnold himself told Frank Zane, with whom he had a close bond at that time, that he would not present himself, that he would only travel to Australia, where the contest was going to be held, to act as a commentator, but that he was now focused on his filming. However, it is said that he only had a few months of preparation. Not taking it too seriously and drinking Diet Coke, Arnold takes that flight to Australia. This year, Chris Dickerson, Mike Menzer, Frank Zane, Boyer Cole, Tom Platz himself was there too, Danny Padilla, Samir Bannout, Cassie Viator, a cast of bodybuilders that predicted a real show that year. And just as everything was about to get underway, the fans in Sydney saw on stage not only a bodybuilder, but a star who had put bodybuilding in exercise. This would be the first Mr. Olympia that Arnold would present himself as a true star. The audience cried out his name because this was a unique event. But the Arnold we saw was not the Arnold of 1975. It was an Arnold with a much more erased physique with dwarfed legs. Of course with a charisma and a smile along with a posing that made the stadium fall down. But it was not the best version of Arnold, and if not, just look at these two comparative photos. But it is true that that year we see Arnold already with a questionable attitude. This became known several years later when Mike Menzer documented everything that had happened behind the scenes in what was probably one of the most talked about Mr. Olympics of all time.
Turned around very rapidly to face me, and he literally had his upper lip was furled around he was snarling like an animal. He said, "Oh, come on, Menzer, we all know that you lost last year because of your big belly."
Arnold knew that Mike Menzer had gained 10 pounds over last year. He knew he was running as one of the favorites. That's why all of Arnold's championships start with the psychological fight. A fight without any scruples whatsoever. Going so far as to disrespect, as he also did with Samir Bannout, or so Mike Menzer tells us, who also tells us that year he saw an Arnold much more accelerated than usual, with a cocky attitude. And so much so that both starred in one of the photographs that years later was understood, one of the greatest confrontations captured on camera in the history of bodybuilding.
He went over and sat in the corner, and when he went to sit down, I continued at him. I was wagging my finger at him, telling him that his behavior was reprehensible, that it was not Boyer Co. who needed to grow up, but him.
It must be remembered that Arnold and Mike Benzer's fight went far beyond the Mr. Olympia of the day. Both represented two very different training philosophies. Arnold's championed by the classic Joe Wader system. Mike Benzer, on the other hand, had been a scholar of high-intensity training, two systems that differed completely and that are still valid today. The struggle went far beyond just these two bodybuilders. Joe Wader had built a perfect business out of Arnold, a business in which he sold his image, his supplements, his own training system, his machines for that system. Mike Benzer's was a more recent trend. Brian Jones' experiments with Cassie Viator, the Nautilus machines, were in clear conflict with the interests of Joe Wader, who was the promoter of Mr. Olympia. So this situation provides the perfect breeding ground for a rivalry.
That irritated Ben Weider, and he stood in between Arnold and I and tried to assert himself. I just remember thinking how out of control he was. And equally as interesting was how out of control Ben Weider and the hierarchy of the IFBB were. Joe Weider told me later that Arnold was on cocaine that day. And in looking at some of the photographs later on, I believe that he had symptoms of being on cocaine.
And it is true that day Arnold was totally out of his mind, revolutionized. Since that Mr. Olympia against Sergio Oliva in 1960, where he came in second place, things had changed a lot. Of course, when it's time to show his physique, Arnold transforms himself, show the public an absolutely confident image and imperfect pose, show the public an absolutely confident image and imperfect post. Despite this, Mike Menzer is aware that he is much better off. He had gotten that crystal clear skin, exceptional conditioning. His narrow waist certainly competed with Arnold's massive frame. They were different physiques. Better shoulders, Menzer, bigger Arnold, but in better condition that day, Mike, so the battle was on. Also Chris Dickerson, spectacular condition. Frank Zane, who was coming off an injury, came in very good defining condition, but had lost a lot of size. The point is that Arnold wins over the crowd. Let's remember all that he already meant to bodybuilding. Now, however, all that remained was to wait for the verdict of the judges, who should assess with total impartiality. And when they were ready to do so, they named Mike Menzer in 5th place. Mike Menzer can't believe it. He picks up the trophy and leaves with a clear gesture of anger. The same thing happens to Chris Dickerson when they name Arnold Schwarzenegger as the winner. No one could believe the situation. Arnold, for all those present that day, had his characteristic physique, of course he did, but he was not at a level worthy of being Mr. Olympia. Of course, the next day the media already began to speculate a total rigging of the waiter who would be behind this decision, pulling the strings. And that day Mike Menzer was so resigned that he would never compete again.
1980, I placed 5th at the Mr. Olympia, a contest that I and almost everyone else who witnessed it was convinced was fixed.
Well, my immediate gut level reaction was paradoxical as it may sound, was laughter. I just started laughing. It was ludicrous. It was so obviously an incorrect decision that my first response was just to laugh.
It's interesting, at the 1980 Olympia, the only people who saw Arnold as the winner were the 7 judges and his closest friends. None of the other competitors saw him as the winner. None of the audience, or very few, only those that were his friends. It was just me saying this, and of course in the aftermath, all the magazines carried articles pertaining to the fact that it was fixed, and as a result decided to drop out of competitive bodybuilding. This brought it all into focus, and I didn't want to be involved or associated with people like that, and decided to drop out.
The following year, Frank Zane and many other bodybuilders decide to make a total boycott of the 81st Mr. Olympia. They don't show up and keep their word. That Mr. Olympia we already saw in Tom Platz's documentary, where they also very controversially have won a Franco Columbo or an obvious gynecomastia and also a very questioned Olympia and had been boycotted. And I tell all this so you can see how big the controversy was in that Olympia of 1980, one of the Mr. Olympias that will undoubtedly resonate more in the future of history, and that paradoxically he does not even mention in his documentary. Arnold thus put the finishing touch to an impeccable career as an athlete. 7 Mr. Olympics. No one had ever achieved such a feat. The following year, the movie Conan the Barbarian would be released at the box office, being a success and placing him as a Hollywood star. Arnold, without anyone coming to him, knew how to get together with the right people, in this case Joe Wader, so that no one could overtake him. He also knew how to get into the movie business. And what we had yet to see from Arnold was still unimaginable. The ambition, the mentality, and above all the coolness to take actions that would always place him as the greatest, the hero, the star that would undoubtedly mark an era. And all that had started in a village in Austria from which it seemed impossible to leave. And at this point of the documentary, I want to say that I am trying to build the story not only from the point of view of Arnold, who has been the one who has transcended what the Wader brothers presented to the world as fitness and bodybuilding, but as you can see, I also want to do it from what was left in those other victims, such as Mike Menzer, who seemed not to know how to recover from that fateful day, as well as Sergio Oliva. Many years later, his son came to say that he always held a grudge against the Wader brothers for what they did, as he lived a lifetime without going through a straw asterisk. And it is very curious to know all this because it is clear that the action hero here was going to be Arnold, and my intention, believe me, is not to make any value judgment, but to get to understand that contrast of mentality, that of a man who from his childhood was willing to achieve an end regardless of the means, and those who suffered this excessive ambition in their flesh. Because no, it was not only Sergio Oliva or Mike Menzer, Arnold's life that we all know, which took him from being just another bodybuilder to perhaps one of the best known people of the last century, because it was what bodybuilding did afterwards. And before we go with it, if you are liking this documentary, the best thing you can do is leave a comment, a like, follow me on my Instagram by staying tuned for everything that's coming up on the channel, and we'll continue. But Arnold's journey would not end here. Arnold was not only the most famous bodybuilder, but he worked hard to bring it to the general public. For several years he went on multiple shows, did interviews, meetings, And thanks to Arnold, who was already becoming a movie star, bodybuilding transcended into what we know today as fitness in general. People started working out at home thanks to seeing a super muscular man on TV shows. And if that wasn't enough, his career in the Barbarian movie had been a smash hit. However, multiple directors had told him that he had no place in cinema at the time, but in the 1980s the world began to change. People began to demand action heroes. The cinema that marked an era with films like Terminator, Executioner, Predator, all these movies could only be shot by a person with that aura of masculinity, of confidence, and the hero of that generation was to be none other than Arnold Schwarzenegger. With Terminator, they break the box office. It becomes one of the highest-grossing films in history, and what Arnold had done as a bodybuilder is already surpassed by a movie star on an international level. There isn't a person in the world who doesn't know Arnold, and he took it upon himself, and he says it very clearly in his documentary, that at this time he focused on transcending, so that people didn't just see him as the muscular bodybuilder who doesn't know how to do anything else, but as a star, and so he was. Arnold is one of the few people who has managed to succeed in every field he has set his mind to. Because once his career as an actor was over, he set himself one of the biggest challenges, not to say the ambition that denotes that we are facing one of the most ambitious people who have ever existed. And it is at this point that Arnold manages to enter the American high society by pairing up with none other than a Kennedy, with Maria Schreiber. We will always be left wondering to what extent this was not just another part of Arnold's ambitions. The former bodybuilder and actor marries Maria Schreiber, they start a family, and he decides to take the step of entering politics, no more and no less than in California politics. And for those who don't know, managing California politics means as much as having the power over one more world power. We are talking about a state with 40 million inhabitants and one of the largest economic powers in the United States. With all that this implies, and imagine what that meant for the news and for the world. The Terminator could be governor of California. If Arnold could achieve this, what was left for him to achieve? Just to be president of the United States. The thing is, the US Constitution prohibits an immigrant from becoming president, but knowing Arnold, I think there is no doubt at this point that he would go for that and more. Arnold is governor of California from 2003 to 2011, getting re-elected. The boy who dreamed of Steve Reeves' movies had surpassed the ambitions that anyone could imagine. He had come from nothing and achieved it all. But this is where the dark side of such an ambitious mindset comes in. It is that in bodybuilding we could already see everything he was willing to do to get what he wanted. From overpowering his rivals to having an inherent gift for knowing how to be with the right people at the right time. He did this in bodybuilding with Joe Wader. Joe Wader exploited Arnold to the max, and Arnold got all the fame. They both gained from that relationship. Now with Maria Schreiber, he had access to something that without her would be much more complicated. Without showing himself as a family person and not being in high places, Arnold could hardly give for that candidacy. But for all of you who have seen the documentary that Netflix has presented to us, we see a last part of a certainly repentant Arnold. Although I don't know if regretful is the word, but rather conscious. Aware of his success, but also aware of the price he paid to get there. That price was to put his entire family life aside. In his best years, of course, he rejoiced in enjoying his fame and fortune. It was said that in the filming and in his time as an actor, he also always showed a lascivious attitude. Moreover, his career as a politician suffered from accusations that he had behaved in his time as an actor. But what really changed Arnold's life forever was when the New York Times revealed that he had had an illegitimate child. A really big mistake in the life of a man who had always shown himself as someone familiar and who hid all this for many years, not only to the world, but also to his family. Arnold had been having sexual relations with the home caregiver, who had been for more than 2 decades in his home. Relationships that led him to become pregnant and have a son named Joseph, whose face was identical to that of one of the greatest bodybuilders of all time. When this became known, Arnold had to recognize his mistake, and from then on, everything changed. Maria River separates from him, and the family life she was now ready to enjoy is never the same again. If you have seen the Netflix documentary, you will agree with me that now we see an Arnold especially concerned about his family and paradoxically all his children. The one who became a fan of bodybuilding was his illegitimate son, with whom he would eventually end up keeping a close relationship and insisting a lot on how proud he is of him. And it's funny how you can see traits of Arnold's prodigious genetics in the physique that Joseph Boehner has worked on. But friends, we must crown this documentary, close it with a conclusion, and it is that Arnold's life makes me think too much. It makes me think because he could be the example of an extraordinary life. A born motivator who encourages you to achieve your deepest dreams, that anything is possible. If he has done all that he has done, anything is possible. However, the bottom line is that we will remember Arnold for bodybuilding, for movies, for politics, for his successes, but also for his failures. And I believe that this is precisely the greatest lesson that an unrepeatable life can leave us, a life full of moral dilemmas. I would like to know to what extent many of you or Arnold himself would reconstruct many of the steps he took in his life to achieve success. As we have seen in all that fortune, there is a dark side, a dark part that involved taking down enemies, betraying friends and leaving aside many pillars of life. I believe that rather than seeing Arnold's life as an example, if we see it as a great learning experience, we can come out of this documentary infinitely wiser. Now I pose the question to you, do you really believe that without that overwhelming mentality of sacrificing a father's funeral for a competition, of cheating a rival, of moving for his own self-interest at all times, could Arnold really achieve all that he has achieved without that little Machiavellian nuance? Although to say that if there is one thing that should be clear to us, it is that Arnold is the living image of having a vision. In a world where people move by inertia, by what people will say and dragged by other people's thoughts, Arnold faced his parents, faced the world, aimed for the stars, surpassed the moon and reached even beyond the stars. And this much is clear, that without a vision we would not be talking about any of this. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you liked it.
You see, if you don't have a vision of where you go, and if you don't have a goal where you go, you drift around and you never end up anywhere. It's like you can have the best ship in the world, you can have the best airplane in the world. If the pilot or the captain doesn't know where to go, it would just drift around. It would not end up anywhere, or most likely in the wrong place. So I was very fortunate that I stumbled onto my vision. I mean, as you know, I was born in 1947 in Austria after the Second World War. And I didn't really like Austria when I grew up. I couldn't wait to get out of there. I couldn't see myself becoming a farmer or a worker in a factory or anything like that. Even though my parents wanted me to stay there and have a normal life. My father wanted me to become a police officer like he was. My mother wanted me just to stay there and marry a girl with the name of Heidi, hopefully, and have a bunch of kids and run around like the Van Trapp family in The Sound of Music. But that was their vision, not mine. My vision was totally different. I felt that I was born for something special, for something unique, for something big. So I was searching. Then one day I went to school. I remember I was 11 years old, and they showed a documentary about America. And there they showed in this documentary the huge skyscrapers, the high-rises. I don't want to be around here with these little farmhouses and these little buildings, and everything is old. I want to be in America. But now the question was just, how do you get to America? I saw a bodybuilding magazine that had Reg Park on the cover. So I bought the magazine, I took it home, and I read it over and over from the front page to the back. It had everything in there, how he trained, how he was working out in Leeds, England, in a factory town, how he worked out every day for 3-4 hours and became the strongest man of Europe, and how he won Mr. Europe and Mr. Great Britain, and then eventually Mr. Universe, and how he won the second Mr. Universe and the third Mr. Universe, and how he was discovered to play the starring role in Hercules. I read that and I said to myself, wow, this is the blueprint for my life. This is exactly what I want to do. I want to become a bodybuilding champion just like Reg Park. I want to get into movies just like Reg Park. And I want to make millions of dollars and be rich and famous just like Reg Park. Do you know how great it felt that I knew where I was going? Imagine the majority of people don't know where they're going. I knew where I was going, that I'm going to become this bodybuilding champion just like him. So it was just a question of how do you do it? I was so relieved, because when you have a goal, when you have a vision, everything becomes easy. Because remember that in America, for instance, when you study, you will see the percentage of people that like their jobs 74% hate their job in America. Now, there's not much different when you come to Europe. The majority of people don't like what they're doing because they're really not doing it because they didn't have a goal and they followed this goal. They just aimlessly drift around, and then all of a sudden there's a job opening, so they get that job because you have to work. But then when you work, it's a chore. It's work. It's not fun. So if you think about, only a quarter of the people really enjoy what they're doing in life. That is unbelievable if you think about it. So I felt so blessed that I knew what I was doing. It's like a medical student that studies and knows he wants to become a doctor. You know where to go. The Hollywood agent, I want to get into movies. He said, that's funny, Arnold. I ask a studio executive, I say, I want to get into movies. I want to be a leading man. He started laughing. So they all say it's impossible. I said, why is it impossible? He says, because look at how big you are. You weigh 250 pounds. And then they told me, he says, and your accent, even if you reduce all your body weight and everything and have a normal body, your accent, I said, your accent, I mean, it will go give people goosebumps. With the German accent, it will get people the creeps. He says, no one in Hollywood ever has become a leading man that had an accent. Doesn't happen. People in America want to hear their actors talk like John Wayne, or like Burt Reynolds, or like Clint Eastwood. Not like someone on Hogan's Heroes or something like that, some Nazi movie. This is the kind of stuff that they heard. They said, no, you see, it's impossible. And plus your name who can pronounce Schwarzenegger or something like that. No one can pronounce that, so forget about it, Arnold. This is the kind of thing that I heard. Imagine, you go from studio executive to studio executive, from agent to agent, from manager to manager, and they all said exactly the same thing. Now that's very encouraging, isn't it? But you know something? I didn't give a shit. I didn't. And I looked back again and learned from what I learned in sports. In my case, in bodybuilding. It's all about the hard work that you put in. To college to study English, accent removal, acting classes, and all of this stuff, all day long. I worked and I worked and I worked. And within a short period of time, I made one movie called Hercules in New York, which of course went right into the toilet. But it didn't discourage me. I still had the same vision. When people said we don't have the time, we have 24 hours a day. We sleep 6 hours a day, so that gives you still 18 hours. So we have 18 hours a day. The average person works around 8 to 10 hours. Work like hell, go to bed, and early to rise, work like hell and advertise. So you work your ass off, and then you let the world know about your work. That's what it is all about. Let people know. If you have a company, if you have a movie, if you do a sports, work your ass off, but then advertise and let everyone know. But then advertise and let everyone know.